everyone, welcome to the community classroom. This is Dr. Tracey McCarthy, psychologist, attorney, and educator, and we are continuing with the response series, and we are going to be addressing in this portion the issue of inter-ethnic violence. I thought it would be great to start off with some New Orleans jazz, street jazz music to get us started with our discussion. So I hope you enjoyed that musical compilation there. And I want to start off talking about this issue of inter-ethnic violence, which is a part of these discussions, actually. I want to start off talking about it by comparing it with the issue of domestic violence. And when there is domestic violence, violence is not always physical. Often domestic violence, interpersonal violence, is psychological, meaning it's mental or it's emotional in nature. And one of the issues that keeps coming up and that strikes me is that there is what looks like a justification for what I am seeing psychologically as abuse. And not only is there a justification being given for some of this abuse, but there's also this insinuation that the abuse is deserved. And so that this inter-ethnic violence, if you will, is deserved. And so when you get to a point where an individual who is acting in an abusive manner justifies the abuse and then also indicates that they believe that the abuse is deserved, then you're looking at something more akin to intentional predation. So it's not accidental, it looks very intentional, and it looks predatory on many levels. And so I want to get us started with a quote. And the quote is from LUVVIE. And I came across this quote actually years ago. And so I'm a little surprised that this conversation has come up now, and I'd almost forgotten about this quote. But let me give you this quote, and this quote pretty much characterizes perhaps a lot of what is going on for this individual when they are articulating their ideas about the intra-racial, inter-ethnic conflict that is going on. And so the quote is, it's related to the word Akata. And according to LUVVIE, and this is a quote, "It is a Nigerian word. Although a lot of West Africans use it to identify African Americans, it's so commonplace, most people don't know Akata means wild animal. Most just think it's a word for African American." Now, I want to point out that I don't know personally any of the individuals who've been involved in these discussions, including LUVVIE. I am approaching this from an academic standpoint, approaching this from a psychological standpoint, approaching it from a legal standpoint. And so this issue of inter-ethnic psychological violence basically is taking place between three large continental groups. And the groups are African country nationals, Caribbean nationals, and American nationals. And what I want to, we're going to have a jump off point here, and we're going to jump off by talking about the what's known as the African American human rights struggle. And the African American human rights struggle pretty much started in earnest from about the 1860s through the 1960s. And this struggle made it possible for large groups, large waves of African nationals and Black Caribbean nationals to enter the United States. The issue with this has been that many of those nationals for a variety of reasons, and I can get into that in some subsequent discussions. But many of those nationals have basically little more than contempt for what would be considered Native Black Americans, American colored people, American Negroes, Indigenous Black Americans, and American persons of color. And basically what is going on is that both racism and classism form the basis for some of the African national and Caribbean national disdain and condescension towards indigenous American Blacks, Negroes, colored people. And these issues and their implications warrant significant, critical, and ongoing examination across time. And this examination really needs to take place on multiple levels. It is something that needs to take place in academia, in particular, since academics are the ones who do the bulk of the research. It's also something that needs to take place on a legislative level, and it's also something that needs to take place on an executive level. And so that needs to occur. And actually, Congressional Black Caucus is coming up in a few weeks. And so it is something that Congressional Black Caucus should be entertaining, and it is something that they should have already entertained over time. They've had plenty of time to entertain that, and they should be entertaining that in earnest. And so let's talk about what's going on. So there have been some researchers. This isn't a new issue, by the way. Researchers have reported that as a group, many Caribbean nationals who are immigrants believe that their immigrant group is held in high regard in contrast to Native African Americans. And what has happened is this has resulted in many Caribbean and African nationals and immigrants encouraging their children to distance themselves from Native Black Americans. And this is basically done in order to circumvent those children being possibly mistaken for an actual Native Black American. This also serves to preclude those children from being on the receiving end of any negativity associated with being a Native Black American. So this would help to preclude them from being subjected to negative stereotypes and biases and all forms of discrimination that they envision the children would experience if they were identified as Native Black Americans. And so in this way, they are fully aware that there is supposedly and actually a stigma attached to being Native Black American. And so this distancing is, it assists with precluding discrimination in educational settings and precluding discrimination in employment and housing situations. And it also precludes being harassed in many ways, even though there is the belief that racially all people of a particular race experience the same types of discrimination. That's not actually true. That is it's imagined. That's just not true. There's a little bit more going on with ethnicity than many people understand. And a researcher by the name of Joseph in 2013 pointed this out. Also, a researcher, Heinz St. Clair, back in 2006, noted that some Caribbean immigrants take particular care to differentiate themselves from what are known as Southern African Americans, because there's a tendency to view those individuals as particularly inferior. Now, it's unclear as to why this particular ethnic band of Native Black Americans has been singled out for this special ostracizing and marginalizing by Caribbean nationals, but that's what this researcher pointed out way back in 2006. And hopefully playing some of that Southern music gave us a sense of some of the superiority and giftedness of Southern people. Okay, so also according to researchers Portis and Zhao, in 1993, Caribbean and African national immigrants were seen as willing to associate themselves with Native Black Americans if they were in geographic locales where Native Black Americans were held in high esteem, where they were seen as revered, or they were seen as valuable, or they were seen as progressive, and having some sense of social and political and economic power or clout. And for whatever reason, there has been the belief that that is not the case for Southern Native Black Americans. And I'm not exactly sure why that would be the assumption. And a Guyanese researcher, Professor Perry Mars, back in 2004, indicated that in terms of the social struggle, this idea of social struggle, that Native Black Americans tend to be what is known as race conscious. And so the focus for Native Black Americans in America, and this makes perfect sense, the focus is on race and categorizing people according to race. That's really an American dynamic. So the categorizing people according to race versus categorizing people according to ethnicity, because in the United States, historically, prior to 1960, the 1960s, people were pretty much categorized according to race. And if you look at old census records, you will see that in many instances, a person was either classified as what was known as white, or they were classified as what was known as Negro or person of color. And so there were not these other iterations of culture. There were not these iterations of ethnicity even possible in the census back then. Now, in contrast to this race consciousness that Native Black Americans are used to, and the way that Native Black Americans understand the world largely, which is what is the driving force for Pan-Africanism, because Native Black Americans are seeing this monolith almost of race. And I'm not saying that all Native Black Americans are seeing this, but those who believe in Pan-Africanism are actually seeing this monolith and believing that there's unification based upon this monolith. Now, conversely, African nationals know very well, they are in a predominantly what you would call a Black culture, climate, national space, a continental space even, where they are in the majority. The same with many Black Caribbean nationals. They are in spaces where Black is the majority. And so they do not necessarily focus on race consciousness. Now, this is just a human trait. People like to stratify things. And so they like to see themselves often on a ladder at the top of the ladder. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking, it doesn't matter what race, it doesn't matter what sex, it doesn't matter. People have a tendency to want to feel better than other people. And so when you don't have race to do this comparison and contrasting, you come up with something else. And so in the Caribbean and on the continent of Africa, there is often a focus on class. And so there's a class consciousness. But that class consciousness is also mitigated by race consciousness, even though they don't say it's race consciousness, or they may not admit that it's race consciousness. You know that the race consciousness is there because there is a privilege granted. There's a system of privilege that's granted based upon the color of skin and the texture of hair. And so there is that race consciousness there, but there is an extreme focus on the issue of class versus the issue of race. In fact, this skin color casting system that goes on in Africa and that goes on in the Caribbean is one of the reasons that people from the Caribbean and people from Africa migrate. Particularly in the Caribbean, The migration is sometimes driven by the fact that even though the individuals may have the education, the skills, and the knowledge to do certain jobs in certain Caribbean spaces, those individuals may be unable to ascend in terms of social and economic prominence because of their skin color, because there is a preference, there is a privilege attached to lighter skin in many Caribbean spaces. And so therefore, if a person is of darker hue, then they may not be able to access that that level of prominence. They may not be able to access all of the opportunities that someone of lighter skin may be able to access. And that's really never discussed when people are talking about the issues of immigration, but that is a major issue. And it's something that does need to be addressed in those discussions. And the other thing that needs to be addressed is that migration to the United States provides Caribbean nationals and African nationals who are already situated socioeconomically in their home spaces. They're situated socioeconomically as largely middle class and even upper class. Of course, people would have to be, because it costs money in order to migrate around the world. So the individuals who are really poor really don't get an opportunity to migrate, even if they can't access prominence and they can't ascend because of their skin color. And so having those economic resources allows those individuals to migrate, whereas those of lower socioeconomic status would not be able to do so. And so the family members and the friends who remain in Africa and who remain in the Caribbean in particular, more so than Africa, in the Caribbean, those individuals who remain there tend to often still be impoverished. And so what takes place is that the family members come to the United States seeking an opportunity to raise their social, economic, occupational, all of those standings, so that they can help those family members who are still living in poverty, perhaps the poverty that they envision Southern Native Black Americans are living in. They are sending those resources back to provide assistance to the families in Africa and the Caribbean. And so it could be, in various forms. It could be shipping food, remittances, those sorts of things. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about this class consciousness and why it's an issue and why it is fueling this interethnic psychological violence that's going on. The class consciousness of many African nationals and Caribbean nationals and immigrants, it has resulted in, if they are looked at collectively, it's resulted in these groups basically strategizing to position themselves socially, politically, and economically above Native Black Americans. And this is as Caribbean nationals tend to view Native African Americans as collectively of low status and collectively of low social regard in the United States. Now, quite frankly, I know that some researchers think that. I don't really believe that on an unconscious level that that's what's going on. Quite frankly, I can't envision that anyone would want to migrate to a space where the individuals that look like them are actually of that low in terms of social regard. I really don't believe it. I think that there's something else operating. I don't think that it is the real, authentic perception of this low social regard. I think that that is a defense mechanism to deal with a number of issues. And so many Caribbean and African nationals migrate to the eastern seaboard of the United States. And this primarily is New York and South Florida and those areas in between there. And so their competitive focus tends to be related to Native Black Americans in those particular states and in that part of the country. And so the diversity, if you will, Black diversity is really heavily concentrated in that area, that eastern seaboard and that southern Florida region. Now, one of the things that researcher Heinz St. Clair noted was that when African nationals and Caribbean nationals arrive in the United States, that they take great care, not just with the children, but they take great care to segregate and differentiate themselves from Native Black Americans. And one of the ways this is done is by strategizing to move into what are known as former white ethnic enclaves, where European Americans lived before white flight took place. And so the goal is to move into those, if you will, abandoned spaces. And this is really obvious in places such as South Florida and in other parts of the eastern seaboard. And even as early as the 1980s, this has been going on for a while, even as early as the 1980s, some researchers noted that there was a rise in interethnic tensions in the United States, particularly in these areas. And so this coincided with the increase in African national and Caribbean national immigration. And so familiarity did not do anything but apparently breed contempt. Now, I know a lot of the discussions take place in the social media sphere, and the conversations around these issues tend to be conversations between younger people. It's a conversation, though, that does need to incorporate a larger group from all of the communities. And so many younger people may not even be aware of the fact that a number of Black scholars have already been addressing these issues over time. And so these issues have not gone unnoticed by African American intellectuals and Caribbean intellectuals, all the way from law professor Lonnie Guinier and Henry Louis Gates and Guyanese professor Mars. And so these issues have not gone unnoticed. And one of the things that Black scholars have identified is that Caribbean immigrants, they are generally seen as, this is how Black scholars have been looking at them, the operation of the individuals has been generally negativistic, extremist, and divisive. And that's one of the things that Professor Mars was commenting on. And he also indicated that Native Black Americans tend to experience Caribbean national immigrants as highly disruptive and arrogant with respect to the struggles of Native Black Americans. And this can probably, this can be extrapolated to many Native African nationals. And there's no need for anyone to make a comment about, but it's not all. Of course, I know that it's not all. We all know that it's not all, okay? And so this is what the researchers have found. And so consistent with the class versus the race consciousness of many Caribbean nationals, researchers have also indicated that Caribbean immigrants have perceptions of discrimination. So that race-based discrimination that people talk about, they have a different perception of it. And it varies from the experiences of African Americans. Back in 2015, Forsyth Hall and Carter indicated that the individuals, Caribbean nationals, tend to focus on individual achievements while overlooking, minimizing, and inadvertently internalizing racism. And so that might be an odd concept for somebody to entertain, that, a Black person is identifying with being racist or advancing racist ideologies. And it's the internalization of racism. And so even through my own ethnographic activities, my archival research, general conversations, I have come to more fully understand the negative dynamics that take place between Native Black Americans and many Caribbean and African nationals. And my preliminary conclusion, it's not positive, by the way, so I will tell you that. It is definitely not positive. My preliminary conclusion is that based upon the depth of the psychosocial and political nature of this schism, it's huge. And it's really heavily based on competition. And it's really heavily based on this survival of the fittest sort of notion. It's really, in terms of Maslow, it's really lower level functioning kind of stuff. It's that safety, it's security, food, clothing, and shelter type of competition that appears to be going on. And because of that, because of how deep this is, and because it is so politicized, it is highly unlikely that anytime soon these groups are going to see each other as compassionate towards each other or as compassionate allies in relation to each other anytime soon, in the future. I don't see it happening anytime soon. When you have systems that are set up the way they are, and you have individuals who believe they are fighting over crumbs, and you have individuals who believe that they have opportunities that other people don't have, or when you have people believing that there's some opportunities out there that they have not been able to avail themselves to, there's a tendency for people to get kind of violent, if you will, get a little violent in the scrabbling over crumbs, basically. And so, again, I don't see this. This is one of the reasons why I do not see this pie in the sky fantasy about Pan-Africanism ever coming to fruition. Now, you don't have tribes in Africa who are getting along in such a way that it would suggest that Pan-Africanism is even possible. And so when you don't have people getting along on a smaller scale, it's a leap to believe that including even more people is going to be the key to this getting along. And I want to finish with this. I know that there are some people who are encouraging, what we call solidarity and having allies. And I think you can have allies on an individual level, but when you're in an abusive relationship, it is not a smart thing to have an ally who is abusive. And so you have to really carefully think about that. And there are some individuals who, they normalize abuse, and so being abused is normal for them. And so they would possibly be encouraging of this alliance. But I am telling you, as a psychologist, I am telling you, as a person with common sense, I am telling you that if someone is abusing you, and someone is justifying the abuse, and someone is also indicating that they believe that the abuse is deserved, that you are never going to have a happy, healthy, wholesome, functioning relationship. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care and see you soon.